Welcome to the 360 virtual tour of Eureka's historic Chinatown. My name is Katie Buesch, and I'm from the Eureka Chinatown Project, and I'm your tour guide for today. The Eureka Chinatown Project is a collaboration of community members and the Humboldt Asian Pacific Islanders, or HAPI, in solidarity. Today's tour of the Eureka Historic Chinatown is a story of resilience and resistance, including reclaiming history to build a more inclusive future. We start today's tour in front of this mural, originally painted in 2000 by Brian and Jasper Tripp and Almy Allen, titled "The Sun Set Twice on the People That Day." It is a mural remembering and holding space for those who were murdered in the 1860 Wiyot massacre on Tuluwat Island. It is also a mural representing the hope for return, the return of tradition, language, land, and health to the Wiyot people who were targeted in the 1860 massacre, and all Native people who have been targets of genocide. Eureka's Chinatown occupies unceded Wiyot territory. Eureka's Wiyot name is Jarujiji, which means where you sit and rest, as opposed to the settler notion of Eureka I have found it. May we work to make this place one where we can all sit and rest safely while paying respect to those whose land we are on. This mural is a reminder of the story that we are exploring today of the Eureka Chinese community is not isolated, and was happening within the context of larger removal efforts happening locally, regionally, and nationally against Chinese people, but also Native people and other immigrant groups. In contrast to the city of Eureka that you see today, in the late 1800s, Eureka was an isolated outpost with no direct connection to the world other than by steamship or rugged overland roads. The roads in town were dirt, there were no sewer systems, and the forest extended down to the edge of town, which at the time was only about 4 blocks away from Chinatown, or 8 blocks down from where we stand today. The Eureka Chinatown was established during a time of extreme racism and genocide against the Wiyot and other local tribes, and the lives of the Chinese people that resisted became interwoven with the tribes. Our call to action is to share something you learned today with at least one other person. An easy way to do that is to share this video. With that, we will begin our story of Eureka's Chinese population, how and why they came here, the factors leading to the 1885 expulsion, and the results of the expulsion. Populations were booming in China at this time, specifically the Guangdong province, and many wanted to immigrate. Reasons to leave China included active civil unrest and internal wars fueled by Western imperialism and natural disasters including 14 serious floods, 7 typhoons, 4 earthquakes, 2 severe droughts, 4 epidemics, and 5 great famines. The gold rush brought people from around the world to California. Additionally, Collis P. Huntington of the Central Pacific Railroad and other industrialists actively recruited immigrants to build the railroads. Chinese workers helped to build some of the biggest and most important railroad and road infrastructure projects in the country. In 1850, a foreign miners' tax was placed on miners who were not citizens, and Chinese people were barred from becoming citizens at this time. This tax provided a majority of the funding for the newly founded state of California that year. These taxes, along with shifts in how mining was done, led to more Chinese workers coming into towns for work. They became farmers, fishermen, laundry workers, road and other construction workers, servants for the newly wealthy upper classes, merchants, and some operated opium dens or gambling halls. Overt local, regional, and national racism against Chinese people increased and grew violent as a perceived competition for jobs and economic security increased, particularly after the nationwide recession of the late 1800s and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869. If you look east on 4th Street from E, where we are now, you'll see what Chinatown in 1885 looked like. The roads around Chinatown were built in a way that prevented water from draining out, and this was at a time when indoor plumbing in rural towns was rare. In the 1860s, this site was near the edge of town. Chinatown was built on scrap lumber on rented land. By 1885, there were about 3,000 people living in Eureka, and approximately 10% of them were Chinese. A natural slow-moving stream moved through the area, so it was swampy. Because the road slowed drainage, the water pooled and it became smelly and stagnant. Many white residents complained of this public health hazard, which was detailed in local newspapers. Chinatown served as a central place for Chinese residents to celebrate holidays and traditions, speak their languages, eat traditional foods, and come together as a community for support and protection. But we also note that the Chinatown block was not the residence of the entire Chinese population. Some people lived on farms or ranches farther out from town. Chinese owned and operated businesses were also located nearby in other areas of Eureka, like the foot of F Street. As I mentioned a little bit ago, historical newspaper stories document anti-Chinese racism and hostility, coincident with the United States recession of the late 1800s. More and more negative sentiment was incited, blaming Chinese individuals for disease, opium, and conditions allowing Chinese people to work for lower wages, thus undercutting the pay of white workers. While Chinese workers were paid less than white workers, part of this pay inequity can be contributed to the division of skilled versus unskilled labor, which frequently is divided on the basis of race. Skilled laborers, a workforce that also enjoyed the protection of union representation, were more stable compared to unskilled labor, which could be seasonal and vulnerable to changing economic forces. Trends of anti-Chinese sentiments can be directly linked to increases in unemployment of low-wage, unskilled workers, and in 1885 was one of those periods of growing unemployment and uncertainty that pitted white workers against Chinese workers. Editorials and biased reporting fueled anti-Chinese sentiments, and non-Chinese people boldly expressed their bias through boycotts and physical and verbal harassment of Chinese people in the streets. Chinese people were not allowed to testify against white people in court, so there was no legal recourse for the daily harassment that Chinese people experienced. With this context, here is the mural commissioned by the Eureka Chinatown Project by artist Dave Young Kim, painted in 2021. Here's Dave talking about the mural.
What really struck me upon doing my research was this unfair description of the Chinese as being dirty. There was a particular line that really stood out, and it described the fondness the Chinese had for the ducks that they allowed to swim in the pools beside them. And I knew right away I needed to resurrect that duck, bring back that duck, the Mandarin duck native to China, and use the duck to symbolize the sacrifices and the desires, the wants, the ambitions these young men had when they came over to this country. The duck represents young love. The duck represents a prosperous family life and children. Something I think we all desire in some form. And the yellow in the background is gold. It represents the goal that the opportunities that the young men came seeking, looking for a better life for themselves and their families back home. And then you see the Chinese character's homeland, which alludes to China, the homeland they left, but homeland in America, Eureka, that they came here and settled and founded. And the red and white circles are traditionally representations of the sun and the moon, talking about the passage of time, oftentimes paired with characters that are blessings and good luck and symbols of prosperity to those in the vicinity. And then you see in the background that sort of faded the historical Chinatown, a depiction of what the town actually looked like in monotone, kind of pushed back into the background. And on the bottom corner, there's a portrait of Ben Chin, the new wave of Asians, the first brave soul to return to Eureka and establish a Chinese restaurant after the expulsion, more than decades later.
HAPI and Eureka Chinatown Project wish to preserve the stories of past injustices against Chinese residents, uncovering what really happened and exploring how it happened in the first place. Raising awareness of this history and recognizing its long-lived impacts will create a more inclusive community that can recognize and counter similar emerging patterns. As we round two corners of the Eureka Chinatown block, we will see two more Eureka Chinatown Project contributions. Two wayfinding signs that provide information to pedestrians about this site, including the history of Chinese populations and the story of the Chinese expulsion, with photos from Cal Poly Humboldt Special Collections and the Clarke Historical Museum. Before 1885, Eureka's residents depended on Chinese members of the community for many things. For example, Chinese farms provided fresh vegetables to Eureka. After the expulsion, vegetables had to be shipped from San Francisco and frequently arrived moldy. Here on the block of land bounded by E and F, 4th and 5th Streets, over 300 Chinese people once lived in a bustling Chinatown. But high unemployment, economic uncertainty, and a perceived competition for jobs served as excuses for anti-Chinese hate. Across the Pacific Northwest, a brutal wave of ethnic cleansing followed the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first U.S. law to ban immigration by race. On February 6, 1885, a white Eureka City councilman named David Kendall was accidentally killed by a stray bullet. The blame fell on two Chinese men. That night, a mob of a couple hundred people gathered near Chinatown and erected a gallows in the vicinity of 5th and F Streets. Eureka leaders ordered all Chinese people to leave within 24 hours. Fearing for their lives, families were forced to leave behind furniture, merchandise, shrimp boats, and vegetable farms. Eureka's segregated one-block Chinatown was obliterated within a few years of the expulsion. It's important to acknowledge that across California, the Chinese people fought back. They organized the first general strike in California. Vegetable growers boycotted households and hotels that supported the exclusion, And in 1886, Eureka's displaced Chinese community sued the city in a historic Wang Hing versus the City of Eureka court case, one of our nation's first lawsuits for reparations, which we'll hear more about at the end of the tour. The 1885 expulsion is exclusively documented from pro-expulsion sources and largely from newspapers. We recognize that all historical sources contain a viewpoint and bias, but these are usually countered by sources from other perspectives. Unfortunately, counter perspectives are rare in the case of Eureka's Chinatown. With this in mind, we can continue to ask questions while we hear the historical narrative and ask what might be missing from it, like the perspectives of Chinese residents and those who lived in Eureka who did not support the expulsion. In Eureka's Chinatown, Chinese people could only rent small plots in a poorly drained, foul, and swampy area. They were essentially banned from owning land before 1885. Following the 1885 expulsion, city and county leaders actively discouraged Chinese people from settling here through legal codes and cultural attitudes, encouraging white residents to not rent to Chinese individuals or purchase from stores or companies who employed Chinese labor locally or elsewhere. By the 1950s, Eureka's city ordinance banning the employment of Chinese people and the National Chinese Exclusion Acts were finally repealed. In the post-exclusion era, World War II veteran Ben Chin, who is featured on the mural, was one of the first to settle in Eureka. He opened a successful restaurant and remained, despite continued harassments and threats. Built in 1876 to celebrate the United States' 100th birth year, the Centennial Hall was the site of a mob gathering during the 1885 Chinese expulsion. Within 20 minutes of Councilman David Kendall's death, hundreds of people gathered at Centennial Hall, which stood where the Arkley Theater's back parking lot is now. The mob agitated for something to be done about the death of David Kendall. Some proposed burning down Chinatown with everyone in it. Others proposed driving everyone out of town in general. The sheriff and a reverend urged moderation and peace, but in the end, a committee of 15 city leaders was formed to enforce a final resolution on the Chinese community. All Chinese people were to leave their homes and be at the docks in 24 hours to be sent to San Francisco. Some of the residents had been in Eureka for over 10 years. Newspapers at the time touted this as a nonviolent expulsion that was orderly and restrained on the part of white citizens of Eureka, because there were no reported deaths or injuries. This Eureka method became a nationwide model of how to remove Chinese people quickly with minimal legal problems. Ranch hand Charlie Moon, Chinese miners near Orleans, and Chinese cooks for rural lumber camps were among the few who remained in Humboldt County after the 1885 expulsion. Charlie Moon was born in Guangdong Province around 1860. He arrived at age 10 or 11 and was about 13 when he began to work at Tom Bear's ranch on Redwood Creek. When the expulsion was happening in 1885, Moon was about 25 years old. Some sources say that a group of men went up to the ranch to take Charlie to San Francisco, and Tom Bear took out a shotgun and told them they had to get through him first. The group left, and numerous articles claimed that Charlie was, quote, Americanized, and was allowed to stay. He worked at Tom Bear's ranch for 70 years. He would go on to marry a local native woman and raise a large family. Moon's modern descendants today number in the hundreds, if not thousands, and many remain in Humboldt County. To honor Moon's and others' tenacity and resilience, the Eureka City Council renamed this alley Charlie Moon Way in 2021. We're now on the path that the Chinese residents took when they were expelled from Chinatown and sent to the waterfront docks. As we pass the corners of 4th and F, recall that there were gallows erected around here as a threat to Chinese residents who might have refused to leave. Keep that in mind, that after this event had ended, it was touted as a non-violent expulsion, despite these overt threats of violence. So what happened after the Chinese expulsion? Oftentimes the story of the Chinese expulsion ends with, all Chinese people were expelled, and no one came back until Ben Chin in the 1950s. This narrative buries stories of Chinese resistance and hints of submission, which is untrue. Some newspapers note that a Chinese man, Charlie Mock, working through a white agent, attempted to purchase land on 2nd Street in Eureka a year after the Chinese expulsion. The Committee of 15 came together to force Mock out. When he claimed he didn't have money for passage on a ship, the committee raised the money and took him to a ship to leave. The Chinese were determined. 1 year after the expulsion in 1886, a Chinese man named Wang Hing and 55 other former residents, including 2 women, filed suit against the city of Eureka from San Francisco for loss of their property and outstanding wages and debts owed to them. The Eureka City Attorney, S.M. Buck, agreed to handle the case. According to a July 4, 1889, Humboldt Times article about the expulsion, at the time, a city statute stipulated that the city was, quote, responsible for injuries to real or personal property situated within its corporate limits, done or caused by mobs or riots, end quote. Due to the Committee of 15's close political and business associations with the city of Eureka, many served on the city council and the committee's chair was the mayor, The committee itself was liable to be sued if it was found that the city should have intervened to stop the forced removal of the Chinese residents. Other towns that removed their Chinese population in a similar fashion watched closely for how the lawsuit might progress in case their own town would be similarly liable. In the end, the lawsuit was never pursued to its conclusion. An article Buck wrote claimed that the statute of limitations for what had happened in Eureka had passed, allowing the case to be dropped. Other stories claim that because the Chinese could not become citizens, they were not legally recognized to have property, and therefore couldn't have lost property in the expulsion. Another story is that the Chinese filed the initial lawsuit, which was then edited by Buck, who deemed the core parts of the case irrelevant. That mob action, unfettered by the city, led to the expulsion, making it virtually impossible to prosecute, so the case was dropped by the Chinese. Although Wing Hing lost the suit, similar efforts successfully prevailed in towns in Wyoming, Washington, and elsewhere in California. The Chinese fought back for their rights and, in some cases, won. After the case closed, the city's statutes were quickly amended in Eureka and other places to prevent future lawsuits like Wing Hing. Proving that the 1885 expulsion was not an isolated incident, Chinese residents were driven out of Arcata, Crescent City, and nearby towns by the end of 1886. In 1906, Humboldt County again expelled a group of 23 Chinese, Japanese, and Russian workers who were hired to work on a cannery on the Eel River. They were deported by ship back to Astoria, Oregon, but not before demanding and receiving wages owed to them. A number of Chinese laundries operated at the foot of F Street, and truck or vegetable farms operated by 8th and K Streets on the outskirts of town at the time. The land we are on now was owned by lumber baron and later mayor of Eureka, John Vance. Once the expulsion had concluded, the Chinese buildings were torn down and replaced with an artisanal waterworks. As research continues into Eureka's Chinese population, we continue to find evidence of Chinese businesses outside of the Chinatown core. Chinese workers also sometimes lived in the homes or businesses they worked in, from private homes to hotels. This section of the waterfront is approximately where the Chinese residents were forced to wait in warehouses during the expulsion. In San Francisco, some residents came together to file the Wing Hing lawsuit, while others melted into the city, but their memories and experiences did not disappear. Stories continue today, regionally, particularly down in San Francisco, that Humboldt County is a dangerous place for Asian and Chinese individuals, largely due to this passed-down historical record of exclusion, expulsion, and discrimination circulating in communities outside of Humboldt County. While California's Asian population is about 15% of the state population, Humboldt County's is just around 3% of the county population. The work of Humboldt Asian and Pacific Islanders in Solidarity, or HAPI, and the Eureka Chinatown Project today is bridging the past and present and the future. We celebrate the history and culture of the Chinese community in Humboldt while raising awareness of the local expulsion events and the historical federal and state exclusionary acts that continue to shape our society today. By educating our community, we hope to heal, grow, and move towards a more inclusive future. History is being made now through the amazing work of the Humboldt Asians and Pacific Islanders in Solidarity and the Eureka Chinatown Project. Thank you to the Clarke Historical Museum for their support in the production of this tour, along with the Cal Poly Humboldt Special Collections and Digital Media Lab, and intern Ann Howard for her work in filming and producing this tour. To learn more, visit hopihumboldt.org, and don't forget our call to action. Share something you learned from today with at least one other person. An easy way to do that is to share this video.